The snow did not begin gently. It came down in thick sheets before dawn, striking the log wall of the cave like handfuls of thrown gravel. Eleanor Marsh was already awake when the first heavy gust hit. She did not rise in panic. She lay still on the flat stones she had warmed the night before and listened. Wind against wood. Snow driving sideways, the steady breath of fire coals outside the entrance. She pressed her palm against the limestone beside her. It held its quiet warmth. That was enough. If you have ever been given something meant to end you, and watched it become the reason you survived, stay with this story. 3 months earlier, they had stood at the mouth of this cave and laughed softly. Not loud laughter, the kind people use when they believe they are being generous. Walter Marsh had handed her the folded paper without meeting her eyes. 5 rocky acres, a hole in a hillside. "No one can say we turned you out," Agnes had said. The words were neat. Arranged carefully, Eleanor had taken the paper and climbed the hill without answering. The cave was wide at the mouth, too wide. Wind moved through it like an uninvited guest. She had stood inside that first night with her cooking pot in one hand and felt the air, not cold, not warm, unchanging. That detail stayed with her. The earth did not swing with the weather the way houses did. It held steady. She built the wall in October, logs cut and stacked by her own hands. Moss packed into gaps until her fingers split and bled, a narrow doorway, a small window sealed with oiled paper. She set flat stones outside in a curve and learned how to place the fire so the heat pushed inward instead of fleeing into the wind. The valley watched. Men passing on the lower road slowed their horses. Women carrying baskets looked up and shook their heads. Margaret Holt had climbed the slope one afternoon and stood with her hands folded. "A cave is still a cave," she had said. Eleanor had stirred her small kettle and answered, "It keeps what it's given." Margaret had not understood. Few of them did. By November, the cave held warmth through the night. By December, it held enough food stacked into natural shelves in the limestone to see her through lean weeks. And by January, the valley below had stopped looking up at all. They assumed she would come down when the real cold arrived. They assumed the hillside would teach her a lesson she had not learned in England. Now the lesson had come. The storm roared for 2 days without pause. Eleanor fed the fire in careful measures. Not too much, not too little. Heat gathered in the stones and stayed there. She moved deeper into the cave when the wind screamed. The air did not bite her lungs. The floor did not freeze beneath her blankets. On the second morning, she opened the door long enough to measure the drift. Snow stood shoulder high against the wall. The valley was erased. No fence lines, no roads, no smoke. She closed the door again and stood still in the dim light. No smoke, her eyes narrowed. The Marsh farmhouse chimney had never failed in winter. Not once in 30 years. On the third morning, the storm stopped. The silence felt heavy. She waited, counted her breaths. Then she unbarred the door. Snow pressed against it with weight. She forced it open inch by inch until white light flooded the cave. 8 feet, maybe more in places. The valley lay buried, and the farmhouse chimney stood cold. Eleanor stepped back inside. She looked at the stacked wood, at the warm limestone, at the small world she had built from what they had meant as dismissal. She wrapped her scarf tight around her throat, pulled on both coats, took the mattock from its hook. She did not hesitate long. Some decisions are clean. She stepped into the drift and began cutting a path downhill. Behind her, the cave held its steady warmth. Ahead of her, a house waited without smoke. The snow swallowed her legs by the third step. Eleanor drove the mattock handle down before each stride, testing depth, finding the buried ground by sound instead of sight. Wood, fence, rock. She moved slowly, breath steady. The cold bit through her gloves and then settled into her fingers like something that intended to stay. Halfway down the slope, she stopped and listened. Nothing moved, no livestock, no voices, no chimney crackle carried by wind. The farmhouse roof showed first, a white rise where shingles should have been visible. Then the top edge of the second-story window. She reached the south door and began cutting. Snow packed hard against the wood. Each strike of the mattock sent powder back into her face. Her shoulders burned. She did not stop. When she cleared enough to reach the latch, she knocked once. No answer. She knocked again. A faint sound shifted inside. Not strong, slow. The door opened inward by inches. Agnes stood there wrapped in 3 blankets, her breath fogged in the hallway. Behind her, the room held a gray stillness. The hearth was nearly dead. Walter sat upright in a chair near the coals. His beard was rimed with frost from his own breath. He looked at Eleanor without speaking. The house smelled of cold ash and damp wool. "You're coming with me," Eleanor said. Walter's jaw tightened. Agnes did not argue. She turned and gathered 2 small bundles already tied and waiting near the stairs. Walter tried to stand without help. His knees shook once before they locked. Eleanor did not reach for him. She waited. He steadied himself and stepped forward. The walk back up took longer. Walter stumbled twice. Agnes kept one hand under his elbow, silent. Eleanor cut the path ahead of them. Snow filled in behind almost immediately. The storm had left no mercy in its wake. When the cave wall appeared through the trees, Walter stopped. He stood looking at the logs, at the curve of hearthstones blackened by steady fire. Smokes rose in a thin line, not dramatic, certain. Inside, the air felt different, not hot, even. Agnes stepped in first. Her shoulders dropped as the warmth touched her skin. Walter followed. He pressed his palm against the limestone wall. Held it there. Eleanor closed the door behind them and set more wood on the fire outside. Heat pushed inward. The cave accepted it. They sat without speaking for a long time. Eleanor poured broth into 3 tin cups. Walter's hands trembled when he lifted his. He did not spill it. Agnes drank slowly, eyes closed. That night, wind rattled what remained of the valley. Inside the cave, the warmth stayed steady. On the second day, Walter tried to step outside. Eleanor stopped him with a hand against his sleeve. "Not yet," she said. He did not argue. On the third day, Agnes moved closer to the back wall where quilts hung. Her fingers brushed the limestone as if testing something she did not fully trust. She left her hand there. That evening, while Walter slept, Agnes spoke quietly. "I thought you would leave by November," she said. Eleanor added wood to the fire without turning. "So did everyone," Agnes swallowed. "We gave you this hill because we believed it would send you back across the ocean." Eleanor said nothing. Agnes looked at the steady flame reflected in the stone. "You did not leave." No, Agnes nodded once. In the silence that followed, snow shifted off branches outside. On the 5th morning, the sun struck the cave entrance for the first time since the storm. Light slid across the floor. Walter stood beside Eleanor at the doorway. He looked down at the valley. White broken by narrow dark lines of fences emerging again. "We burned chair legs," he said. Eleanor kept her eyes on the horizon. I saw Walter's shoulders rose and fell once. He did not look at her. "When I gave you this land, I did not think you would learn it." She let that settle. "I did," he nodded. The admission hung between them like breath in cold air. Below, smoke began to rise from another farm where neighbors had finally cleared their roofs. Walter watched it for a long time. Then he turned back inside the cave that had not defeated her. It had kept them alive. The valley did not forget what happened. It tried to. For a week after the roads cleared, people spoke of the storm instead. 8 feet, roof beams bent, livestock lost, but stories have a way of moving where they are not invited. By Sunday, men climbing the North Ridge paused when they passed the cave. They did not laugh. They looked, really looked. Caleb Foster came first with a load of split oak on his shoulder. He set it by the wall without ceremony. "I should come sooner," he said. Eleanor nodded once. "You're here now." He stepped inside and stood still. The warmth touched his face. He gave a short breath through his nose. "Feels different than outside," he said. "Yes." He ran a hand over the log frame and then left without more words. Others followed that week, not in crowds. In ones and twos, a sack of potatoes, a jar of preserved peaches, an extra blanket. No one named it repayment. They placed things quietly and moved on. Margaret Holt climbed the slope 3 days later, alone. She stood at the entrance longer than she needed to. Snow still lined the edges of the hearthstones. The cave held its calm air. Margaret stepped inside. Her boots scraped lightly on stone. She turned once in a slow circle. Her face showed nothing at first. Then her eyes lifted to the limestone ceiling and stopped. "It's steady in here," she said. "Yes." Margaret pressed her gloved palm to the wall, held it there. She removed the glove, pressed again. She swallowed once. "I misjudged this place." Eleanor waited. "And I misjudged you." The words came stiffly like joints unused. Eleanor did not rescue her from the moment. Margaret lowered her hand. "When the chimney failed," she said quietly, "Walter would not have walked to my house. He would have stayed until..." She stopped. Eleanor did not answer that either. Margaret looked at her directly for the first time without the practiced smile. "You did not have to go down that hill." "No." Margaret nodded. She stepped back into the sunlight and walked down without looking behind her. Walter and Agnes returned to the farmhouse once the roof was cleared and wood dug free. The house breathed again. Smoke rose straight and confident, but something had shifted in the way Walter climbed the slope after that. He came once a week at first, sometimes with rope, sometimes with beeswax. Once with nothing but his hat in his hand. He stood at the entrance and watched Eleanor tend the fire. He did not fill silence with talk, he watched. One morning in early February, he spoke. "I knew about this cave before I gave it to you." Eleanor kept splitting wood. "I expected that. Silas told me about it 30 years ago." The axe paused midair. Walter looked out at the valley. "I could not give you something that would end you. I did not think you would stay long enough to learn it." She set the axe down. "But you did not stop me." "No." Walter rubbed his hands together slowly. "I was wrong." The words seemed heavier than the logs stacked beside them. Eleanor studied his face. It was different now. Less arranged, more human. He met her eyes and held them there. "For what it is worth," he said. "I see you. It was not polished. It was not grand. It was enough." Agnes came that Sunday afternoon. She brought bread. She stood beside Eleanor at the entrance and watched the late light fade over the snow. "I lay awake in this cave the second night," she said softly, "and listened to the stone hold its warmth. I had never known a house could feel like that." Eleanor said nothing. Agnes folded her hands. "I spent months hoping you would leave. I did not want to learn you." A pause. "I was wrong." The word trembled slightly in her mouth. Eleanor reached forward and adjusted the kettle hook over the fire. "Winter has a way of correcting people," she said. Agnes let out a breath that carried weight with it. The invitation came a week later. Dinner at the farmhouse, properly. Eleanor walked down the hill in the late afternoon light. The door opened before she knocked. Agnes stepped aside. Walter stood near the hearth, not stiff, not guarded, simply waiting. There was a chair set at the table, not at the edge. Among them, they ate quietly at first. Bread passed hand to hand. Stew ladled evenly. At one point, Walter glanced toward the window where the cave hillside was visible through bare branches. He did not speak. He did not need to. Weeks later, when the snow thinned to patches and brown grass began to show through, Eleanor climbed back to the cave at dusk. She stood at the entrance and pressed her palm against the limestone. It still held its steady warmth. Below, smoke rose from the farmhouse. The valley moved again with ordinary sounds. She did not smile. She did not speak. She stood there until the last light faded and the first cold edge of night returned. The cave remained what it had always been: stone silence, steady heat, given in quiet, held by those willing to learn it. Eleanor turned and went inside. The fire caught, the warmth gathered, and the hillside no longer laughed.